Welcome to the deep dive. Whether you're prepping for a massive strategic meeting, catching up on the absolute bleeding edge of tech, or you're just insanely curious about how the world actually works, you are in the right place. Today, we're kicking off a brand new series by the Connected Ideas Project, or PCIP, exploring a really massive unified theme. We're looking at biomanufacturing reindustrialization.
Yeah, and it's an absolutely critical moment to be looking at this, honestly. We have a fascinating stack of sources to synthesize for you today. We're pulling from strategic national security blueprints, highly technical venture capital primers on factory economics.
The really dense stuff.
Exactly, the dense stuff. And deep dives into the operational reality of actually scaling biotechnology.
Right. And the overarching mission for this deep dive is to take all of those reports, the financial models, the policy memos, and weave them into a single cohesive story. Because we're looking at this bizarre historical paradox. The United States effectively invented the foundational science of programmable biology, but somehow entirely outsourced the actual physical manufacturing of it.
Which is wild when you think about it.
It is. And more importantly, we're going to look at exactly how a new generation of builders plans to steal that manufacturing capability back before a critical window permanently closes. So, okay, let's unpack this.
To really grasp the stakes here, we have to strip away the glossy, kind of futuristic veneer that usually surrounds this topic. When most people hear a word like bioeconomy, they tend to picture a pristine, perfectly quiet laboratory room.
Oh, yeah, like an Apple store, but with microscopes.
Exactly. People in crisp white lab coats, totally silent.
But the sources paint a completely different picture of what it actually takes to build this stuff at scale. It sounds, frankly, incredibly gritty.
It is viscerally physical. There's a striking scene detailed in the operational reports that perfectly captures this reality. Just imagine you're standing inside a pilot biomanufacturing facility. They're attempting a 5,000-liter fermentation run.
Which is massive.
Right. Now, the genetically engineered organism they're using is a total marvel of modern science. It worked flawlessly at the bench scale in a tiny controlled beaker. It even worked when they scaled it up to a 500-liter tank.
But I'm guessing 5,000 liters is where the wheels fall off.
Oh, completely. The moment they push to 5,000 liters, the physics of the tank change. The oxygen transfer just completely fails. Because the environment is different, the organism gets stressed, and its metabolic profile shifts in entirely unpredictable ways.
It panics, basically.
Pretty much. The microbe stops producing the high-value chemical you want and instead just starts reproducing itself, or worse, producing toxic byproducts. Suddenly, your yield drops by a massive percentage.
And just to set the scene for you listening, this is not happening in a quiet room. The facility smells overwhelmingly like warm yeast.
Yeah, it's a very specific smell.
And the machinery pumping the fluids and cooling those massive tanks is so loud it literally sounds like the engine room of a nuclear submarine.
And right in the middle of all that noise and heat, you have a lone process engineer. This is someone who represents a very rare breed. There are maybe, a few hundred people in the entire country with this specific type of hands-on industrial-scale biological expertise.
Wow, just a few hundred.
Yeah, it's a tiny talent pool. And they're standing there staring at raw sensor data, trying to debug a massive living, breathing system in real time. You have to rely on this deep biological intuition because there is no standardized software runbook for a living organism that's mutating under pressure.
Right.
That right there is the reality of the bioeconomy. It's loud, it's chaotic, and it is incredibly difficult to control.
It sounds like an absolute nightmare to manage, honestly, but why is there such a rush to figure this out? Like, if the science is so hard to scale, why not just take our time and perfect it in the lab first?
Well, what's fascinating here is the sheer geopolitical urgency driving this. We don't have time to stay in the lab. While that lone American engineer is struggling to make a 5,000-liter run work, the rest of the world, specifically our geopolitical rivals, has been scaling up aggressively for decades.
Decades.
Yeah. The numbers are incredibly stark. If you look at the global production of active pharmaceutical ingredients, the essential APIs that actually make your medicines work, the U.S. share has just collapsed. 3 decades ago, the U.S. produced about 23% of the world's APIs. Today, that number is hovering around 3%.
Wait, 3%. So we invented the underlying science for most of these modern therapeutics, but we only physically manufacture 3% of the core ingredients. How did we let that happen?
We fundamentally miscategorized the technology. The U.S. historically treated biology as a field of academic discovery. We wanted the Nobel Prizes.
You wanted the breakthrough path.
Exactly. But our rivals treated biology as a field of industrial design and massive, heavy-duty scale. Today, China holds nearly 58% of all global synthetic biology patents. They essentially own the biomanufacturing contractor market.
The sources mention massive companies like Wuji Aptec.
Precisely. Wuji Aptec and similar colossal contractors are the backbone of the industry right now. Industry surveys suggest roughly 79% of U.S. biopharma organizations are actively relying on Chinese contractors to actually brew and manufacture their discoveries.
That is a staggering dependency.
It is, and the bipartisan consensus right now across multiple recent national security strategies is that the U.S. has a remarkably tight window to correct this trajectory.
How tight are we talking?
About 3 years.
3 years.
Yeah, if we don't start putting steel in the ground and building massive domestic capacity within the next 36 months, the embedded knowledge gap and the supply chain dominance will become effectively permanent.
That is a terrifyingly short runway. And it sounds like closing that gap means we have to completely rethink what a tech company actually is. Because for the last 20 years, Silicon Valley has taught us that intellectual property is everything. In software, the IP is the code.
Right. You write it once?
You write it once, and you copy and paste it a billion times for free. But the sources suggest that in this new world of programmable biology, the code, the DNA, isn't actually the most valuable part.
That is the crucial paradigm shift of this entire thesis. In this emerging asset class of tech-enabled manufacturers, the factory itself is the product.
The factory is the product.
Yes. The competitive moat isn't a clever patent filed away in a lawyer's office in San Francisco. The true moat is the physical production process. It's the hard-won operational knowledge of how to keep that 5,000-liter tank from crashing. It's the tiny, incremental yield improvements your workforce discovers on the factory floor.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because that sounds like an economics textbook. But what does it actually mean for a company trying to build one of these factories?
Well, it connects directly to a foundational manufacturing concept called Wright's Law, or the learning curve. Wright's Law dictates that costs decline by a predictable fixed percentage with every doubling of cumulative production.
Right. It's why solar panels and flat-screen TVs used to be luxury items and are now incredibly cheap.
Exactly. The competitor who has produced the most physical volume has traveled the furthest down that learning curve. They have the lowest costs.
And because they have the lowest costs, they win more contracts, which lets them produce even more volume, which drives their costs down even further. It's a compounding advantage.
You've got it. And right now, foreign competitors are miles ahead of us on the biomanufacturing learning curve. Every single year we delay building domestic capacity, they are doubling their production, learning new efficiencies, and getting further out of reach.
But here's what I don't quite grasp. The U.S. is still a manufacturing powerhouse. We're the second largest manufacturing nation on Earth. We know how to build massive oil refineries. We know how to build millions of identical trucks. Why can't we just point that existing industrial might at biology?
Because brewing biology requires a completely different type of manufacturing than building a truck. The U.S. is incredible at massive, static, long life cycle production. We're great at making millions of tons of steel or pouring endless concrete. But biomanufacturing required something called HMLV, high mix, low volume production.
High mix, low volume. Give me an example of what that actually looks like in practice.
Think of it this way. Instead of a factory that makes the exact same car chassis every day for 5 years, an HMLV factory might need to brew a specialized plant-based aviation fuel on a Tuesday.
Okay.
Then on Wednesday, they have to completely flush the massive tanks, sterilize miles of piping, recalibrate thousands of sensors, and prepare to brew a highly sensitive, customized pharmaceutical protein on Thursday. It's short lead time, constantly changing, customized production.
That sounds like a logistical nightmare. The downtime alone, just from cleaning the tanks, would destroy your profit margins.
It is the hardest manufacturing problem to solve, because every single job requires a different setup. And historically, the only way to make HMLV profitable was to throw thousands of cheap laborers at the problem to manually clean, retool, and recalibrate the factory floor.
Right.
But the sources argue that the modern solution isn't chasing cheaper labor overseas. The solution is fundamentally digitizing the factory floor.
So we're talking about bringing software into the physical realm, software-defined scheduling, automated pipe cleaning, and capturing the knowledge of how to run a batch in code rather than just hoping your best engineer doesn't retire.
Precisely.
But whenever we start talking about digitizing a factory floor and bringing in robotics, the immediate fear is job replacement. People assume this means firing a skilled machinist and buying a robot arm.
That is a very common misconception, but the national security blueprints are clear that this is a labor-shifting strategy, not a labor-replacing one.
How so?
We actually have a massive critical shortage of highly skilled tradespeople in the U.S. right now. The master machinists and senior process engineers are aging out of the workforce, and we just don't have enough people replacing them.
So how does the software fix that without just eliminating the human altogether?
By automating the specific skill rather than the person. Imagine a manufacturing task that currently requires a specialized operator who makes $45 an hour and has 10 years of apprenticeship under their belt. We don't have enough of those people to build a bioeconomy.
Right.
But if you use software assistance, AI-driven diagnostics, and robotics to vastly simplify the complexity of that task, suddenly a $20 an hour operator with a few weeks of training can step in and safely run that same machine.
Oh, I see.
You haven't replaced the worker, you have empowered a fundamentally different, much larger pool of labor to participate in advanced manufacturing.
That makes total sense. You're lowering the barrier to entry for the workforce. But even if we solve the labor pool problem, I'm looking at the economics in these reports, and I have to ask, if the demand for domestic medicine and materials is so high and the science works, why aren't startups just building these factories everywhere? What is actually stopping them?
To understand why these factories aren't springing up, we have to look at the structural hurdle that absolutely crushes hardware and biomanufacturing startups. If we synthesize the central thesis of today's deep dive, it comes down to a single phrase. Biomanufacturing fails in circles, but it scales in spirals.
Fails in circles, scales in spirals. I like that. Walk me through the failure part first. What is the circle?
It's often called the circle of death in the industry.
Yeah.
It's a closed loop of impossible prerequisites. It goes like this. As a startup, you need massive production volume to descend that Wright's law learning curve and get your costs down.
Right.
But to get massive volume, you need to build a massive commercial facility. To build that facility, you need hundreds of millions of dollars in capital.
Okay, so you go to investors.
Right, you go to investors. But to secure that kind of heavy capital, the investors demand to see predictable, proven biological yields at scale. They won't give you the money unless they know the 5,000-liter tank works.
Oh, man.
But you can only prove your 5,000-liter yields if you have the facility to run the volume.
You need the factory to get the data, but you need the data to get the factory. The system is completely locked.
It's entirely closed. Startups get stuck in this loop, burning cash, waiting for a financial certainty that will never mathematically arrive, and eventually they just die.
So how on earth do you break that loop? If the private market won't take the leap of faith, who does?
You smash the circle using two very specific sledgehammers.
Yeah.
Government demand signals and patient capital.
Let's translate those demand signals first. This is where the reports talk about the government stepping in to act as the anchor tenant for a new technology. They mention tools like advanced market commitments, or AMCs, and a specific $762 million biomanufacturing program from the Department of Defense.
Exactly. An AMC is essentially the government saying to a startup, if you can successfully build this factory and produce this critical chemical, we guarantee we will buy the first 50 tons of it.
That's huge.
It changes everything. By guaranteeing that revenue, the government completely de-risks that terrifying first batch. They act as the buyer of first resort.
So the procurement signal is the carrot that proves there's a market. But what about the money to actually build the pipes and the tanks? The sources spent a lot of time dissecting the capital stack of these startups.
I have to pause here because when most people think of funding a startup, they picture venture capital. You know, the folks on Sand Hill Road writing massive checks for a piece of the company. Why doesn't that work for a biomanufacturing plant?
Because traditional venture capital is designed for software. VC equity is incredibly expensive money. It expects a massive rapid return. Think of venture capital like buying a lottery ticket for a new app that might go viral and make $1 billion in 2 years with zero physical overhead.
Right. But building a factory is not a viral app. You should not be using expensive lottery ticket money to buy stainless steel vats and concrete.
So what should you be using?
You need what is called project finance or venture debt. Think of project finance like getting a traditional mortgage to build a physical house. The interest rates are lower, the timelines are longer, and it's secured by the physical asset itself.
That makes sense.
But again, traditional banks won't give you a massive mortgage for an experimental biology factory unless it is de-risked.
Which brings us back to the government. The sources highlight proposed tools, like an independence investment fund at the Department of Commerce, which would step in and provide things like loan guarantees or subordinated capital. Basically, the government acts as a wealthy co-signer on your massive factory mortgage.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, That is the exact moment the closed circle breaks and becomes an upward spiral. Government de-risking and co-signing attracts the private project finance. That cheaper capital allows you to physically build the facility. Once the facility is built, you can hire and train that new software-enabled workforce. That workforce runs the batches, gains experience, and improves the yield. That better yield drives down your costs, which suddenly makes your product incredibly attractive to the massive commercial market.
And then that commercial demand brings in even more revenue to expand the facility, and the spiral accelerates upward.
Exactly. It's a beautiful mechanism once it gets spinning.
But the blueprints offer a very stark warning for the builders inside that spiral. They have to be incredibly careful about who they're actually selling their products to once the factory is running. There's a concept in the text called the 7525 rule.
Yeah, this is a strategic trap that destroys a lot of deep tech companies. When a tech-enabled manufacturer relies entirely on government defense contracts for their revenue, they are making a profound error in how Wall Street will value them.
Why is that a trap? If the military wants to buy everything you make, isn't that a guaranteed business?
It is a guaranteed but heavily capped business. The optimal revenue mix for these dual-use companies is roughly 75% commercial and 25% defense. If you look at pure defense primes companies that only sell to the Pentagon, they typically trade at maybe 1.5 to 2.5 times their annual revenue.
That's it.
That's it. The market caps their upside because government budgets are slow, bureaucratic, and subject to political whims.
But the sources contrast that with companies that straddle both worlds. They use Palantir as a prime example. Palantir does vital defense work, but they also have massive commercial enterprise contracts. And because of that commercial traction, they command massive software-like valuation multiples from investors.
Because that heavy commercial revenue proves to the market that your technology is genuinely scalable. It proves your factory can compete on the open market, not just survive on government life support.
But to actually win that commercial market, you have to compete on price. Which means we need to talk about the physical reality of the factory floor again. We spent a lot of time talking about the upstream side of biomanufacturing, engineering the perfect microbe, getting it to survive in the 5,000-liter tank. But reading through these venture primers, it seems like upstream isn't actually the main problem anymore.
It's not. The ugly, unspoken truth of the bioeconomy is that downstream processing is where factories go to die.
Downstream processing. So if upstream is brewing the massive tank of biological soup, downstream is what?
Downstream is the extraction. It's the purification. Imagine you have a 5,000-liter vat of yeast, water, nutrients, and dead cells. And mixed in that massive volume is a tiny, delicate fraction of the specific pharmaceutical protein you actually want. Downstream processing is the agonizingly complex series of centrifuges, filters, and chemical separations required to isolate just that perfect molecule without destroying it.
That sounds like trying to extract a single specific teaspoon of flavor out of an Olympic swimming pool.
That is a very accurate analogy. You can have the best genetically engineered microbe in the world, but if your downstream extraction process is slow and inefficient, your profit margins simply evaporate. That is the bottleneck where you find out if your factory is actually a viable business.
So how do the visionaries in these reports propose we conquer that downstream bottleneck? Especially if we're trying to do high-mix, low-volume production where the extraction method has to change every week.
The blueprints suggest a radical shift in identity. These companies cannot simply view themselves as traditional biology labs that happen to own some physical steel tanks. They must conceptualize themselves as software companies that happen to output physical molecules.
The sources call this new breed of company the frontier firm. What does a frontier firm actually look like on the inside?
It looks like a factory run by highly integrated human AI agent teams. We're talking about utilizing digital twins. Before you even mix a single drop of liquid in the physical world, an AI system runs thousands of simulated fermentation batches in the cloud to predict exactly how that microbe will behave at 5,000 liters.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it anticipates the metabolic shifts. It optimizes the downstream filtration steps. And once the physical run starts, autonomous software agents are constantly adjusting temperatures and managing quality control at a millisecond speed that human operators simply cannot sustain.
It's biology moving at the speed of code. But even a perfectly optimized frontier firm can't do everything itself. They still need specialized pipes, unique sensor parts, custom chemicals. And that brings us to the final and perhaps most ambitious concept in the text, the necessity of building an American Shenzhen of biotechnology.
This is critical. You cannot build a resilient supply chain with isolated factories scattered across the continent. You need what the reports call temporal density.
Meaning the sheer speed of having all your critical suppliers in the exact same zip code.
Exactly. If you look at the traditional hardware manufacturing ecosystem in Shenzhen, China, you have thousands of hyper-specialized suppliers clustered within a 30-mile radius. The density is so extreme that an engineer can design a custom prototype on a Tuesday morning, walk down the street to a specialized machine shop, and have the physical part in their hands by Tuesday afternoon.
Whereas in the US right now, if a custom bioreactor valve breaks, you might be waiting 6 weeks for a cargo ship to bring a replacement across the Pacific.
Which completely kills your high-mix, low-volume agility. To replicate that kind of extreme supply chain density across the U.S., the blueprints argue we desperately need a common manufacturing protocol, a shared digital language.
Because right now, the friction between companies is entirely manual. If I want a specialized part milled, I'm sending PDFs and emails, getting on phone calls. Someone is manually entering data into a machine.
It's incredibly slow. A common digital protocol would act like the Internet's TCP/IP standard, but for physical manufacturing. It would allow a frontier firm's software to seamlessly communicate directly with the machines at a specialized surface treatment facility down the road. The entire ecosystem of fragmented, digitized shops would suddenly be able to operate as one massive, distributed, lightning-fast factory.
Okay, we've covered an immense amount of ground here, from submarine engine rooms in the Circle of Death to project finance and the American Shenzhen. So what does this all mean? Why should you, listening to this right now, perhaps on your commute or at your desk, care deeply about biomanufacturing supply chains and downstream processing?
You should care, because this technology touches the absolute baseline of your daily survival. Let's look at a very grounding, everyday example from the research: acetaminophen, the active ingredient Tylenol and countless cold medicines. Right now, roughly 70% of the U.S. supply of that basic essential chemical comes from China.
Meaning, if a global geopolitical shock occurs tomorrow and shipping lanes close, our pharmacy shelves empty out almost immediately. The vulnerability is absolute.
But domestic biomanufacturing offers a completely different paradigm for national resilience. Researchers are already patenting biological methods to convert ubiquitous, cheap materials like plant-derived lignin into acetaminophen. Programmable biology allows a country to literally brew the exact same medicines, the same critical aerospace materials, even sustainable aviation fuels right at home.
Right.
It ensures that the next time the global supply chain inevitably breaks, your local supply of what keeps society running does not.
It's the ultimate insurance policy.
Yeah.
But, and this is the final urgent call to action embedded in all of these blueprints, we cannot just legislate our way out of this vulnerability. The government can write brilliant strategic reports, they can offer generous tax credits and advance market commitments, but the government cannot physically run a bioreactor.
No, they can't.
They cannot debug a cascading failure in a 5,000-liter fermentation run at 2 in the morning. That spiral of reindustrialization only actually turns if builders, visionary process engineers, and risk-taking capital allocators get inside it and do the incredibly hard physical work of making it real.
The policy window is open right now, but that 3-year learning curve is compounding against us every single day.
It's an absolute race to the finish line. And as we wrap up this first deep dive into the TCIP Biomanufacturing Reindustrialization series, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. Something that isn't explicitly spelled out in the policy memos, but is heavily implied by the sheer power of the technology we've been discussing.
It begs the question, what happens when the very map of the world changes?
Precisely. If biology truly becomes a fully programmable, scalable manufacturing platform, if we actually master the spiral and build these frontier firms, what happens to the global geopolitical map? For all of recorded human history, national power has been strictly defined by geography. Who has the massive oil reserves under their sand? Who controls the rare earth mines? Who guards the strategic shipping choke points?
Right.
But imagine a future, maybe a decade from now, where a nation with zero natural resources, no oil, and no mines can simply brew every single chemical, fuel, and material it needs to power its entire economy and military inside a network of automated AI-driven warehouses. How does a world where you can brew power from scratch permanently rewrite the rules of global conflict?
That is the ultimate promise and perhaps the ultimate geopolitical disruption of everything we've talked about today.
It's going to be incredibly fascinating to watch it unfold. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the future of how we make things, and we will catch you on the next one.